Let's try that again. Unmuting is helpful. Welcome, everyone, to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. I hope you enjoyed that holiday music from our producers behind the scenes. Hope everyone is doing well this December day, a little chilly where I am. I am Katie Nichols. I'm a certified SANS instructor and the Director of Intelligence for Red Canary. And I hope that everyone is going to get a break here very soon for whatever holidays you're celebrating the end of the year. But of course, we have cyber threats. They are still around. We're all kind of hoping there's no knock on wood solar winds type incident this year, but got to keep up with the cyber threats. So I just wanted to hop on as we wrap up this year of 2022, share as usual recent cyber threats that are going on, things that I think it's worth paying attention to. So let's dive right in. Let's start with a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I just taught last week down in DC. Let's talk a little bit about intelligence requirements. So, if you've joined our live stream before, you might have heard me talk about requirements. These are the needs or the questions that threat intelligence can help address. So important to have requirements, but I've heard from so many threat intelligence teams, or even if you're a threat intel person in a SOC, for example, trying to figure out the requirements for why do we even need threat intelligence can be really tough. So I was really excited. I actually just spotted this today. My friend Corson shared it. Just came out 7 hours ago. Um, there's a guide from the Red Hat InfoSec team on developing priority intelligence requirements, right? Abbreviated as PIRs. So be dropping links in throughout so you can follow along or catch up later on with all of these awesome sources. So this is a great way to help you think through what your requirements might be. So they describe, okay, why they developed this, the challenges, their approach. Of course, you have the mandatory Sun Tzu quote for any kind of threat documentation. What was really funny, I really like this Venn diagram. This is the way that I think about a concept we've talked about before called threat modeling, right? And in this kind of orangish circle on the left, that's your organization, right? The operational environment of your org, what you're trying to protect. And then in the light aqua here, that's the external, right? Threat landscape, all of the potential adversaries that could affect you. So what's kind of funny is I saw this and I was like, yes, someone else uses a Venn diagram. So this is a blog post from a couple years ago. Venn diagrams. This is the way to understand, right? Just about getting that overlap between us, our organization, and them, our adversaries or threats. So, kind of a neat Venn diagram approach to that. Doesn't just give you the graphic though; it gives you a step-by-step guide. Right? Step one: identify the core elements of your org's business and strategy. And this is what I find a lot of threat intel analysts will overlook. Right? We're going to get into this later on, of course. Like, let's capture all of the external stuff about Qbot and Raspberry Robin and different Russian actors, right? But a lot of orgs don't start with what they care about, right? Core elements, things like what's in your network? Do you have an open hybrid cloud? Right? What kind of information do you have? Financial information, etc. So describing that as the first step of their recommended process, which I think is awesome, right? Focusing on assets and technology. Again, focusing on your infrastructure. Maybe you have employee personally identifiable information. And as you go along, if you've tuned in before that I love me some spreadsheets, right? They have a spreadsheet to help you organize all of this, which is pretty cool, right? So internal focus, you can list out elements of your organization, right? Business model, right? Then later in the process, right? Rank those. And they give you a nice little formula for trying to calculate a risk score, right? Based on, is this appealing for adversaries, right? What would be the worst case scenario? And then the impact, thinking about if our personally identifiable information, or right, if an adversary put a software package into our pipeline, what would the potential impact of that be? Right. And then they give you a risk score, which is pretty cool. So, Stephen dropped those links in for you. Checking out these steps of this process to, I would argue this is sort of threat modeling, but then a way to develop your requirements, right? You can start out high level, say, okay, based on our assets and infrastructure, maybe we care about certain categories of threats, but right, maybe you get more specific. And this is where, tracking blogs and reports like we've talked about every other month and we'll talk about today can be really useful. So I want you, as we're going through the rest of the live stream today and talking about these different blog posts and reports, thinking about, is this something that would affect whomever you have to protect, right? Maybe if you're a vendor, you have lots of customers you have to protect, or you work in a bank security operations center, you have to protect that bank's network, right? But this is a great process. I don't think I've seen anything quite this structured with a neat spreadsheet, right? Just helping you try to figure out, what do you need to focus on? What kind of threats and adversaries? So I like to kick off our show talking about that because the foundation of so much of what we do in threat intel is these requirements. So shout out to the Red Hat team. Very cool work there. And that's a reference I'll be sharing for many months and years to come. So with that basis, let's move on to some things that have been happening recently in the news. Vulnerabilities. And I forget who jinxed it. Someone earlier this month was like, are we going to have like a major vulnerability this month right before the holidays? And then there were a couple you might have seen last week, right? This SSL VPN vulnerability in Fortinet appliances. This was a remote code execution vulnerability. It's never great, as the name suggests, that allows adversaries to execute code remotely, right? So this was one that anyone who is using a Fortinet device probably needs to pay attention to. Right? These appliances often are facing the internet. They have to be, but a lot of people don't really carefully monitor or update these security appliances. Sometimes they kind of forget about them. So can be a significant risk. And what's really important as we talk about vulnerabilities is if they are being exploited, right? So, really important, this bleeping computer piece notes that yes, this vulnerability has been actively exploited in attacks. That's an important piece anytime that you're looking at vulnerabilities, right? There's the open door. Think of the vulnerability like an open door, but then an adversary has to come through that open door. In this case, yep, they are actively being exploited. So keep an eye out. There are some indicators of compromise that were shared out. Other vulnerability you might have heard about last week, Citrix. So there was this piece from NSA that came out. So Citrix vulnerability in that, and saying that the group APT5, it's a Mandiant name for that group, suspected Chinese actors, have exploited these vulnerabilities. So, right, recommendations here from NSA. This is another one that, right, is worth paying attention to if you have Citrix in your environment, which a lot of organizations do, right, using Citrix appliances. So I really appreciate in this report behavioral checks. We all know pyramid of pain shout out, right? Indicators change, hashes, etc., domain names. So NSA called out some behavioral checks looking for tactics, techniques, and procedures from APT5. And so, as we talked about in previous months, right, all of these things you could translate into different behavioral analytics in your environment, especially if you have some kind of a host-based tool, etc. So let me, before I forget, drop in links to each of these so you can follow along if you would like to. So APT5 exploitation here, definitely worth looking at as well. Another vulnerability that you might be like, aren't we done with this one? Do you remember proxy shell and then the proxy not shell vulnerabilities, right? These ones came out, right? Proxy not shell specifically in September to November, right? So this is a couple months old. And when this one comes out, and this is a pattern that we see over and over again, right? A new vulnerability is disclosed and everyone kind of freaks out and panics. I know when proxy not shell was released, everyone panicked. But we see this cycle, right? When there's a new vulnerability, adversaries don't always exploit it right away. They have to take some time. They have to develop their malware, their tooling, right? Figure out how to exploit it. Then often after there's a vulnerability released, a couple days, weeks, months later, proof of concept code is released. Well, we saw proof of concept code released for proxy not shell. I believe it was earlier this month. And so, why that's important, right? After there's this example code of how to exploit it, sometimes adversaries will pick this up. And so, right, this is a blog post from the team over at Kroll who talks a little bit about the exploitation that they have seen for both proxy shell and then proxy not shell. Again, two different sets of vulnerabilities, but we know that there have been a lot of these exchange vulnerabilities worth watching them. And one of the challenges sometimes is that, right, if you see adversary activity, you don't always know what vulnerability they exploited, right? Unless you know exactly the version of exchange and can compare to the patch level. But regardless, right, very important, if you're using on premise exchange, update it because we're starting to see upticks in proxy not shell exploitation in addition to the previous proxy not shell exploitation or proxy shell. There's a lot of not. Very confusing. Regardless, patch your Exchange servers. I know if anyone's an admin for Exchange, you're saying that's not that easy. No, it's not, but it's really, really important. So, yeah, worth reading there. And again, thinking about this cycle of okay, vulnerability comes out, and then adversaries start exploiting it. On the topic of vulnerabilities, I was really excited to see this 2022 mass exploitation report from the folks over at Gray Noise, who they do a lot of scanning the internet, right? And so they have great visibility into when these vulnerabilities are actually exploited. And this is a great read. I dropped a link into it. Take a look at this because it's a really useful overview of some of the vulnerabilities that are more or less important. If you've never heard of this, the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, KEV, from DHS CISA. Great resource to help you try to identify if anyone at CISA knows about this vulnerability being exploited. So that's a great resource if you weren't aware of that one. So Bob Brutus talks about that here. And then there are a bunch of different sections here talking about different types of vulnerabilities. There are some fun visualizations, a lot of data analysis there. Log4j, that was, I think, a year ago almost. Time flies when you're not having fun. Right? Just kind of explaining that when it initially came out, yeah, it was 2021, December. Not necessarily every adversary will exploit it that first day, right? So I think we saw a lot of different log4j exploitation throughout the year. And so a section talking about that, giving some cool data analysis as well, right? The one I really want to talk about, I love this diagram. Let me scroll down to find it. Lots of good stuff on different vulnerabilities from Kimber. Talks about the hype cycle, the celebrity vulnerability hype cycle. This is so real, right? If any of you are active on any of the social media things, you'll know this is a real thing. Initial discovery, right? You find it, everyone starts talking about it, and then we're in the unknown. We don't really know. We all start panicking. Then we collectively feel depressed. We're like, everything is lost. This exchange vulnerability is the worst, right? Then everyone's like, oh, let's all patch it, right? And then maybe someone produces information like gray noise, and then some of the vulnerabilities fade into obscurity, right? Not everything reaches the level of proxy shell or log4j. Some of them that oftentimes we panic about to start, turns out that adversaries don't actually exploit it that much. So it fades into obscurity, and then other vulnerabilities do become prolific, like log4j and some of these others that Gray Noise talks about in this piece. So highly recommended reading. We'll have a couple other examples coming up soon of sort of year in review reports or blog posts. I think it's nice to, right, throughout the year, think about the patterns, the trends we're seeing, but especially at the end of the year, think about what we've seen for this past year. So this is one example of that. Again, just emphasizing this idea, vulnerabilities, that's the open door. Adversaries still have to come through those doors. So that section on vulnerabilities, worth checking out that report. Moving right along, we got lots to cover today. You might have seen these blog posts that came out last week. And shout out rather to whomever had the Harry Potter inspired title for this Mandiant blog post. And there's a similar blog post as well from Sentinel One. I'll drop those links in before I forget, and Stephen will kindly share those out for you all. All right, first one, starting with this Mandiant blog post with the awesome title, explains, right? They identified a malicious driver that was used to terminate processes on Windows system. If you have followed Mandiant malware names, you know that they have specific malware names that they assign. And so what was interesting is that they observed the use of these malicious drivers. And as they looked further, they found that they were signed, right, with a valid Microsoft signature. Well, that's a little weird, right? There's a whole process for signing code and getting that officially signed by Microsoft. And so as they started investigating, they found, right, this is a little concerning. There are a couple different malware families that have been signed using this process. So this section's great. It kind of breaks down, if you're not familiar with code signing, right? Why code signing is important. Again, it's all built on trust, and right, we trust certain CAs, certificate authorities, who sign code. This happens also in your browser with TLS certificates. You trust. Same thing with code signing. So generally, we trust, right? Our operating system trusts anything signed by Microsoft. So details here about what that process is, right? How that code is used with hashing algorithms, and introduces, right, the Windows hardware compatibility program, explaining what that is, and then, right, the steps that you have to go through to register your hardware, etc. So basically what happened here is that it was found that someone figured out how to mess with this process, right? 9 different steps to submit the signed driver within this process. So, right, after getting through, this should be pretty legit, right? Anything signed with Microsoft verified code. But, right, they said, nope, threat actors have subverted this process, which is really concerning because if you're investigating, right, so scrolling down to different screenshots, I don't know about you all, when I'm investigating a potentially weird file and environment, I look it up in a sandbox like VirusTotal or others, and you look at, hey, is this file signed? And again, cool, signed file, Windows hardware compatibility publisher, cool. I trust this. It's valid. Nothing malicious here. So that's why something like this is so scary, is that, right, a lot of analysts sort of rely on the system of trust to say, yeah, this code is valid. Microsoft says so. So really great research. I have to mention, it wasn't just a Mandiant. It's kind of cool. I always like when companies cooperate. Sentinel One, and I think one other org as well also cooperated. So they have another blog, right? Talks about it just from a slightly different vantage point. Scary piece here, thinking about, okay, what threat actors have used this? Sentinel Labs noted, right, they saw, right, a similar Microsoft driver that was signed ultimately led to the deployment of Hive ransomware. So that's not great, suggesting different actors using these same similar Microsoft drivers. So Microsoft did put out, right, guidance on malicious use, right? Credit to them. They gave credit, which is cool, to the researchers. It was also Sophos, in addition to Sentinel One and Mandiant, who investigated this. So giving some recommended actions, update things, right? These intrusions can be prevented, right? Their analysis indicates that they were used in post-exploitation activity, ransomware deployment, kind of giving support to Sentinel One's assessment. But the good news is, right, they revoked certificates here for impacted files, so should be okay. But a really interesting case study that just came out about how adversaries can sometimes, right, subvert these trust systems like signed drivers. So worth taking a look at. If nothing else, just being aware that this is a technique adversaries can use, and making sure that your analysts know, okay, even if something says it's signed by someone that looks legit, maybe don't trust that. Do more investigation, because that could be malicious in and of itself. So that's a driver's piece. moving right along to another topic that was fun. This one started with a Mandiant blog post. All right, Trojanized Windows 10 installers targeting Ukraine government. Now, thinking back to our requirements and threat modeling section we kicked off with, if you are not in Eastern Europe, if you're not working for the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian organization, this might be a little less important to you, right? Of course, though, like throughout the world, right, we're all concerned and thinking about supporting Ukrainian government in their efforts to protect their systems. So you might have seen discussions about this one. Raises an interesting question and emphasizes the fact we all define words differently, right? Described operation targeting the Ukrainian government, used Trojanized installers distributed via torrent sites. And the blog post noted, right, described this as a supply chain attack. Now, there are different definitions of supply chain, right? This is understandable. People define it in different ways. So, John Holtquist, really great guy, he's been on the stream earlier this year, early 2022, right? John reminding everyone this wasn't SolarWinds, but per his definition, his team's definition, supply chain could mean different things, right? That's okay. So, disagreement on the definition of supply chain here, saying that in this case, right, the adversaries knew how, right, Ukrainian government users often downloaded software via torrent sites, right? With that knowledge, they called this a supply chain attack. Now, even if you don't like that definition of supply chain, what I'd say is just read the blog and take away the defensive findings, right? They haven't tracked this to a FIN or APT using an uncategorized group. But regardless of if you think this is a supply chain or not, supply chain attack or not, things to think about here, Trojanized ISO files. This UNC is not the only group of adversaries who are using ISO files, right? ISO files are a really common delivery vector for a lot of different malware. Think about if those ISO files do not need to be used by your average user, right? Think about preventing those from being mounted in your environments. You can use group policy to do that. So, great detail in this blog post, regardless of whether you call it a supply chain attack or not. So, as always, they gave technical details, which is nice, on the different malware families, infection vector, etc. So, worth a read regardless of what you want to call this type of attack. And especially if you're in Eastern Europe or Ukraine, this might be one in particular to think about how you could identify and detect. Talking a little bit about Ukraine, right? Definitely worth watching that situation this month in particular. There are a lot of different opinions on what Russian cyber operators might do against Ukrainian organizations. No one knows for sure, right? Intelligence analysts try to anticipate. There's one school of thought thinking that, as Russia struggles in kinetic military ops, they might resort to cyber. There are other schools of thought that say that might not happen, right? If they're able to achieve some success with kinetic actions and bombs, they might not need to use cyber operations. It is worth thinking about, though, especially if you're supporting Eastern Ukraine or Russian or Ukrainian organizations, rather, right? Thinking about past cases, 2015, 2016, Russian actors did use malware against electric systems, right, resulting in power outages in Ukraine. So it'd be interesting to think about what happens there this month. If you are involved in defending those orgs, wish you well. Worth kind of keeping an eye out there. No one knows for sure, but we'll kind of see what happens at the end of this year. One piece that I wanted to point out that's particularly interesting. This is from Kim Zetter. This is a Substack that she runs. She's an amazing journalist, and this is free, but I would, she's not sponsoring, but I would consider, if you like her journalism or any other journalists, tell them consider subscribing. This is a really interesting piece. We've heard throughout this year that there are a lot of different security firms who are helping out organizations in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government. That's awesome. But one potential issue or risk with this is, as Kim examined here, right, cybersecurity companies who are helping defend Ukraine could actually be considered participants, right, in the cyber war there. and open themselves up to additional risk or additional attacks. So, kind of a really interesting and thoughtful piece. Various Ukrainian government officials have come out thanking folks like AWS Cloud, right? Other large tech orgs who have assisted and made a huge difference. Mandiant, Cisco, Microsoft, ESET, Recorded Future, right, have all kind of supported Ukrainian organizations protecting those networks. So no good deed goes unpunished, right? Always good to think about the risks. And we don't like to talk about it a whole lot, but there are inherent risks in doing this kind of cyber threat intelligence work in supporting organizations. So hats off to any organization who supported the defenders in Ukraine, helping them out. That said, it's an interesting perspective from Kim, just examining the risks of doing that. All right, so we'll be keeping an eye on the situation in Ukraine, but lots of other threats, different reports going on that I also wanted to share. So this is kind of a grab bag of different topics here. Great report that just came out recently. This first piece from Microsoft deep dives into IIS modules and talks about detecting web shells. Now, I found that, sometimes people are like, I can't understand the details of all of this. Like, I don't know what a web shell does. If you're not from a non-technical background, which whatever that means, there are lots of types of technical. This is a great piece that breaks down, right, IIS modules, the history of them, right, how they've been used maliciously. So a lot of details to help you understand some of these things and discussions about web shells and IIS. I'm always a big fan of good diagrams. And then, as Microsoft always has in their posts, a lot of details that could help you detect web shells or malicious use of IIS modules in your environment. So, very detailed post, worth some investigation of this one. Right here are some examples in this logging and monitoring section. Right here's how you can enable advanced logging, so you even have the capability to be able to maybe detect some of this behavior. So that's a good practice to enable. Web shells, right, are something that a lot of adversaries will use. Common initial access vector, so definitely worth thinking about first off enabling that logging, and then they give some recommendations for doing hunting. Right, this W3W3 or W3WP process rather is often involved in web shell activities. So hunting through, right, process lineage for that, one thing you can do. And as always, right, Microsoft will provide queries in KQL format, but you can always translate these to whatever query format you use as well. So great blog posts. I'm going to make a prediction for 2023 that web shells are probably not going to go away. I like to go with the safe predictions for the new year because things are going to continue, right? The same kind of threats we see right now are almost certainly going to continue next week. That's one blog post to think about, looking at web shell activity. Another one that just came out, I think it was today, if I have my days correct, a Raspberry Robin. You might have recalled this is a cluster that my team at Red Canary actually named called Raspberry Robin. This cluster gets introduced into systems via USBs generally, right? Kind of a worming type malware that is hanging out in a lot of different networks. And great work to the team at Trend Micro. They talk about how gnarly this malware is, to use an old school term, right? How prevalent it is, right? Lots of victims, government agencies, telecom entities, a lot of different industries have been hit in different countries as well, right? It's interesting to see that Argentina has been highly hit, Australia, Mexico, but lots of different organizations across the world. Great graphics here. I like me some graphics, right? Just helps us to understand that USB gets plugged in. There's an LNK file, right? And then ultimately delivers a payload. This blog post talks a little bit about how those Raspberry Robin payloads connect out to Tor sites, the Onion Router anonymization network. So great blog post on Raspberry Robin, which I can confirm continues to be a very prevalent threat across a lot of different organizations. So Raspberry Robin, that's one threat. A related threat, right? We often see malware teaming up. Related threat to Raspberry Robin is known as TrueBot. So great post from the team over at Cisco Talos talking about this TrueBot malware. And they've seen an increase in over the latter half of the year, right? They're not totally sure, but folks think this TrueBot malware might be related to the group TA505, which is tracked by some people under the name Evil Corp. And so, right, Cisco found some additional research that supports that assessment that this TrueBot activity might be associated with TA505. We haven't talked about ransomware yet today. I know, amazing, right? Ransomware still active, still kicking out there. TrueBot is just another example of a ransomware precursor, as we call it. Right? TrueBot has eventually led in some environments to CLOP ransomware being executed. So, as always, great details research here, talking about where TrueBot has been seen around the world, and talks about right the relationship to Raspberry Robin, which is why I like to bring this one up right after. So teams started seeing a bunch of systems infected with TrueBot, and they found that right a lot of these systems previously had Raspberry Robin related malware that then led to TrueBot. So I mentioned in previous months, Microsoft has done some great research on Raspberry Robin as well. It looks like Raspberry Robin kind of teams up with other clusters, delivering different malware families. And TrueBot seems to be one of those that has a relationship. So just an example of, right, okay, Raspberry Robin infection, and then if left unchecked, then TrueBot, the actual payload, will be downloaded. So another example of malware families, clusters teaming up. Raspberry Robin looks like it's dropped TrueBot. So TrueBot is one that seems like a little newer on the scene, not something I've heard a whole lot of chatter about. So worth taking a look at that one. And especially if you're in one of those regions where it's been seen a lot, might be worth focusing on. We don't just have criminal threats, though. We also have state-sponsored threats, and some of the authors were previous star guests. So I want to call out this blog post from Team Proofpoint on TA453, right? A suspected Iranian group, right? That, as they carefully phrase it, moderate confidence that it reflects a flexible mandate to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence requirements. So calling out the different names, I know naming is a tough one. All right, TA453 is the proof point name, overlaps but not exactly with some of these other names, Charming Kitten, Phosphorus, APT42, right, describes some of their different targeting patterns. Again, thinking back to what we talked about in the beginning, requirements. So as you're reading this blog post, be thinking about, has TA453 hit organizations that are similar to mine? Similar industries, right? So they note TA453 is almost always targeted academics, researchers, diplomats, journalists, etc. But some outlier campaigns have hit medical researchers, aerospace, a realtor, travel agencies. So talking about some new techniques, right, that this group has picked up to start to use, right? It's really helpful whenever these reports include the industries targeted because you can think about, okay, are these industries that are similar to mine? Do I need to worry about this? So again, great work talking through all the TTPs, right? The changes in techniques, and worth a read, especially if you fall in TA453's threat model. Talking about, right, some different personas they created as well. Always nice when people share the indicators so you can add those into your threat intel platform or just search them through, see if you're being affected by that. So great work from the team over at Proofpoint. Lastly, I wanted to highlight something a little different, a blog post and a cheat sheet that might help you as you're trying to hunt for all of these adversaries. So not to be too commercial, right? VirusTotal has a product that a lot of threat researchers use, VirusTotal Intelligence. And what's kind of neat is that you can use this functionality to search for malware from different threats in many different ways. So if you are a VirusTotal user, I just wanted to call this out. They have a PDF because everyone loves their PDFs. You could like print this out, right? I don't know about you, but I have trouble remembering how to search for these things. And so even if you're not a VirusTotal user, This is cool because it gives you some examples of the different types of things that you might want to pivot on as you're searching for, okay, we know about one malware family. Are there any other malware families who have used similar document names or file names, etc.? It's kind of a neat little cheat sheet from the team over at VirusTotal that's worth taking a look at. So that's our grab bag section. We are reaching the end of the year, so I wanted to hit on a couple year in review items. One of them is actually from a organization that we don't always highlight, Atlantic Council. Right, this is the think tank, and full disclosure, I'm a fellow there, non-resident fellow. This is kind of a neat one because it talks about the cyber year in review from a policy perspective. I found that a lot of people who are cybersecurity practitioners, many of you work in a SOC or you're a CTI analyst or a red teamer, we don't always talk to the people who are making the policy. And I think it's really important that those communities try to come together, that the practitioners share with people who are informing policy what they think. And so, kind of a neat 5 by 5, looking at the cyber year in review, right? What organization had a great impact on cybersecurity? And I'd be curious if anyone listening has opinions on any of these. Feel free to drop into the comments. What do you think? Who has had the greatest impact on cybersecurity in 2022? A lot of people saying DHS, CISA, right? The Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, JCDC, public-private partnerships making a big impact there. Cyber policies, right? If you're not aware of cyber policy issues, this is a great way. You can start to read from some really smart people, including a representative, or is Langevin a senator? I don't want to misrepresent. US representative. Um, Getting some thoughts from some really smart folks here on different policies that have been implemented. You'll hear this one in a lot of the year-end reviews. Like, what are the most important incidents? This one asking, yet undercovered. If you remember this one, and I think this is a great answer, right? Ransomware that crippled the Costa Rican government. I think that this has been an interesting year in ransomware trends because I'm sure you have heard, like I have, oh, ransomware is getting better, or no, it's staying the same, or it's getting worse. It's tough to say, right? I don't know that anyone really knows, but what we can say is 2022 had a lot of very serious ransomware incidents, and maybe some of those were undercovered. The Costa Rican government was partially shut down. The LA school district, Los Angeles school district, had a ransomware attack by Vice Society operators, right? That was an interesting one as well. So, different answers that I thought were pretty interesting there. Thought I wasn't going to talk more about ransomware. Well, don't worry, right? Ransomware, I thought this was a great piece also by Trend Micro, looking at ransomware trends. It's not formally a year end one, but I think kind of wraps up nicely, right? Looking across this past year, some recent ransomware incidents, and then everyone wants these predictions, right? For 2023. I'm going to give you another prediction in addition to the web shells one. I predict that there's going to be ransomware that affects organization in 2023. I know this is being recorded, so that's cool. You have it recorded, so if there's a ransomware attack, I called it here first. I'm being facetious, right? The thing is that, right, even though it's a new year, a lot of the same things happen. But I thought this was a neat piece looking at future potential trends in ransomware, getting us to think about that. Right. And I love that comment from someone coming in, looking at this as a team effort. We're all on the same team, even if we're with different companies, orgs, agencies. I absolutely love that. And I think to tackle the ransomware problem or any of these other problems, right, we're going to need to team up. It's a great comment. I appreciate that. I thought this was interesting, right? As we try to anticipate, look towards the future, what are some potential changes, right? And I really like how they broke down in this piece what might be some triggers for changes in the ransomware ecosystem, right? And this is, again, sort of dabbling in the policy side. Well, one of the recommendations a lot of people have had over the last couple of years is if governments start regulating cryptocurrency, implementing so-called know your customer requirements, right? Making sure they know where this cryptocurrency is going from and to. Well, saying that if that happens, that could change business models for these ransomware actors, right? Movements to the cloud, that could also change ransomware. So I thought this is an interesting thought piece, thinking through if certain things happen, which I think a lot of people are starting to move to the cloud. How is that going to change adversaries? So, if you are kind of making year end predictions, that's where I would think about focusing, right? What have we seen from adversaries so far? And what might be the triggers to indicate they might change, right? Significant shifts in where we put our infrastructure or in regulatory policies, right? On the policy side as well. So we'll see many more year-end summaries. Um, right, it's tough, I think, in this field sometimes to think about the good and the bad, and we focus so much on all of the bad things, all of the malware we've talked about today, the ransomware, right, supply chain attacks, whatever you call them in Ukraine. But I think my takeaway from 2022, and I hope that you have some of this as well, is that yeah, there are a lot of cyber threats out there, but that there are a lot of people who are doing really good things to stop them. If you've tuned in throughout the year to the live stream, it's been a pleasure to have you on. I hope you've learned a lot. I really love kind of threats. And so, I hope that that's what you leave 2022 with, maybe in a little bit, that there is hope, right? Despite all these threats, I think we as a community have gotten even better at tracking them in 2022. Didn't used to be like this 5, 10 years ago. There weren't all these amazing reports that we could all use to improve defenses. So, in closing, a couple of things I just wanted to note. I know it's the end of the year. I hope you all get a nice break for the holidays. I'm about to head out, see his family, eat some cookies. If you're planning for next year, the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit, I'm a co chair for this with my friends Becca and Rick. This is a lot of fun. It's the end of January. And the summit itself, it's 2 days. You can come in person. We'd love to see you in person. We'll have some exclusive in person things, networking, eating delicious food and drinks. But it's also free for everyone online. So free virtual summit. So go ahead, register for that before you forget, right? Totally free online or right, $300, $325 in person. So that's coming up. We did post the agenda, parts of the agenda. There are some wonderful talks in store, including a keynote by Chris Sanders, really, really smart person. So appreciate that. Totally free to sign up online. Hopefully, you'll sign up for the CTI Summit. Should be a great time. And then I wanted to end on a lighthearted note, right? This is from Will. Tracking the TTPs of an elusive APT group, right? Yes, we can maybe track Santa's TTPs, scrapes network information, comes into our homes, records our activities. So kind of a funny tweet from Will. With that, that's all we have for you today. As I said, thank you so much for tuning in throughout the year. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this community and share all the knowledge on cyber threats with you all. So I hope that whatever holiday you celebrate, that you have a restful end of the year, time with family, friends, time away from work to recharge. We'll hit it hard in the new year. Thank you all. Have a great holiday and see you next year.